All right, so we were looking at Magna Carta. Had the barons at Runnymede had forced King John in 1215 to sign the Magna Carta. He promptly complained to the Pope that he'd been forced to sign it, and of course, if you're forced to sign something, it's not legitimate. Okay, a shotgun wedding. Okay, which is where the father of the bride holds a shotgun to the groom's head because usually the girl's pregnant. That's not a legitimate marriage, okay? So shotgun weddings aren't legal. But you'd have to complain about it. So if you still live in the same town, you might not want to. So if you force someone to sign something in the Magna Carta, no, it doesn't make it legal. But what they promptly did is when King John died, his son, 9 years of age, in 1216, was told if he wanted to be king, he would be signing the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta got issued over and over again, and the details that were in it changed each time it was issued. The first one has a huge point about the king. King John has to return the King of Scotland's mother and wife. And I'm not sure if he had more of his family members that he had captured. But there were all sorts of, he had taken like other kings' family members and was holding them as hostages. So both one of the rulers in Wales and also the ruler in Scotland, both of them had family members that John was keeping as hostages, and he had to return those. Those don't appear in later ones because that's been done. Okay, so some of it repeats, some of it does not. Henry II, or Henry III, he's forced to sign the Magna Carta in order to become king. He's okay initially, but the older he gets and the longer he goes on as a king, the more autocratic he gets and the more I'm going to rule without parliament. As I said, he passed a bunch of anti-Jewish laws, which of course harmed the economy of the country beyond being immoral. Your bankers just walked out the door. How are you going to operate with no banks? Okay. He was in foreign wars, which were complete disasters. And finally, his brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort, leads a rebellion. Okay. And we talked about that already. We talked about the provisions of Oxford, which were the kingdom was going to be ruled by 24 men, 12 chosen by Parliament, and 12 chosen by the king. And that's completely unheard of. I'm not sure where they got the idea. Like, where did they get the idea in the first place? Because it's extremely radical. Up to this point, people believed that kings had been appointed by God himself. And therefore, the king kind of was like an intermediary between his country and God. And to go against your king, the way the British are starting to do, and this won't be the worst, one of their kings, they chop his head off. And another one, they fire him. It's like, nah, you're done. You're fired. We're picking somebody else. Very unusual attitude. In Russia, okay, the Russian royal family, Nicholas and his daughters and son and wife have been made saints of the Russian Orthodox Church because their killing was considered to be a religious act or an anti-religious act. It wasn't just you killed the king, you also killed someone who had a special religious role. So this opposition to the king is a little bit shocking in this medieval Catholic world. So de Montfort rules. The king is sort of being held as sort of hostage. He held other people, but Prince Edward escapes. We talked about that. So Prince Edward escapes, and in a battle, de Montfort is killed, and Edward puts his dad back on the throne, but really he's the one ruling. Okay, so here's our new topic. That was summary from last time. Edward I. As I said, if you've watched Braveheart, he is the older king in Braveheart, the father. Edward I was a very strong king. He was militarily quite successful. But during his reign is when Parliament becomes a permanent institution. By the time of the French Revolution, so all countries had kind of parliaments. They called them different things. In Russia, it was called the Duma. In Germany, in German states, they'd be called the Diet. Okay, so Luther gets called to the diet of worms. That was not a torture where you force people to eat worms. Worms is a city in Germany, and the diet of Worms was actually the parliament at So you had different names. The Estates General was the name for the French one. By the time of the French Revolution, the Estates General hasn't met in like 100 years. And so for in Britain, suddenly Parliament to become permanent, that they meet at a regular time and it's completely normal and this is how we run things. It's not, let's hold them because we're in a crisis. The only reason that the French king goes and calls the Estates General at the beginning of the French Revolution is because France is bankrupt. And he needs to call them to figure out some way to help the country that's now bankrupt. And you would only call these Diet or Duma or Estates General, you only call them in a moment of, oh no, we all need to band together to keep this country afloat. However, here in England, you're getting Parliament as a permanent thing. And I believe part of that is because the 100 Years' War is going on. Okay? So for 100 years, the English kings are basically more concerned with getting back their estates in France than they are in actually ruling England. In fact, most of them are buried in France. Okay, if you want to find the burial place of a whole lot of kings of England, you have to go to France. Okay, because they were also, as I said, Duke of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, Count of Aquitaine, of Anjou, and so that's what they're concerned with. Why? It's warmer, the weather's better, and they could get more money out of it. Okay, they actually enjoyed that half of their role maybe better than being king. Edward I is at war for most of his reign. So a lot of the things that a king would do, Parliament starts to get used to doing. He fights against Wales and against Scotland. Wales, W-A-L-E-S. It has nothing to do with large mammals that spout water out of their head. Okay.
Wales.
W-A-L-E-S. Wales is this area of Britain. Huh?
Wales and
Scotland. He's at war against Wales and Scotland. Okay, famously, in 1297, he loses to William Wallace. William Wallace, W-A-L-L-A-C-E, at Stirling Bridge. S-T-I-R-L-I-N-G, Stirling Bridge. So what happened is, you don't need to write this down. It's like, what's going on here? Why does Edward think he should be running another country? Okay, doesn't he have enough to do already? What happened was the previous king, John, okay, 2 kings back, John had kept King Alexander of Scotland's wife and mother imprisoned. He desperately needs an heir. Okay, this is the last of the Canmore family. These are the people who are descended from Malcolm Canmore. And they've been working busily at making sure there's no other royal line. Okay, so Alexander is the one who kills the last of Macbeth's descendants. They're desperate to get heirs. Okay, the only heir you can have is the child that is born to your legal wife. If for whatever reason you and your legal wife don't have children, then the entire kingdom is in jeopardy because they've been so busy cutting off any other possible avenues for the royal family. There aren't any brothers or nephews or other people, and so it becomes a bit of a panic. So finally what happens is Alexander, there were 3. There's Alexander III at this point. Alexander III is, he's gotten married. And what he wants to do is he wants to go home and be with his new wife. Now, part of that is, you know, if you get married, hopefully you like the person you married, and therefore you want to spend time with them. But the other point is he desperately needs an heir. There is nobody at this point to inherit the throne of Scotland. Nobody. You eliminated Macbeth's family. You eliminated a lot of other people. There was also a failure of reproduction, shall we say, in other areas. And so Alexander III is desperate to get back to his brand new wife and hopefully conceive an heir. His men tell him, don't do it. It's a dark and stormy night. Not a good idea. And he ignores them, and he takes his horse by himself, and he races along this cliffside road in the pouring rain at night. The next day, he and his horse are found at the bottom of the cliff with their necks broken. Now what do? You have no royal family. There are 2 possible families that could be sort of tapped to become the new royal family. And they were the Commons, you don't need to write it down, but the Commons and the Bruces. And so you've got these lords in Scotland, and they all get together and they sit down and say, well, what do we do? We've got to have someone to judge. Should the Commons become the new royal family of Scotland, or should the Bruces become the new royal family of Scotland? Well, who's got the authority to sort of be the referee? Oh, I know. Why don't we ask the king's brother-in-law? Okay, it was Edward's sister that Alexander III was racing home to be with. We'll ask the king's brother-in-law, and they were actually quite good friends. We've got letters between the two of them that are, very, very chatty, like brothers-in-law. So we'll ask Edward to come and be the judge between the two families. He says, neither. Me. King was married to my sister. You've got no royal family left. Guess it's mine. And they're absolutely shocked. It's like you didn't expect the referee to declare themselves the winner of the game. That's not what the referee's there for. And you just have this, fight back and forth. And one of the big problems is with aristocracy, and we're talking about nationalism, where does your loyalty lie? Even the King of England, does his loyalty lie to England, or does it lie to England and all of his French estates? He's got a divided loyalty. He does not want to lose his French estates. Well, these Scottish aristocrats, they also own estates in England. And so therefore, they don't want to tick off Edward. Because do you want your estate in Scotland, or do you want your estate in England? Well, England's richer. It's got more resources. Again, the weather is somewhat better. And so these lords do not want to tick off Edward because he might take away their estates down here. And so instead of showing any loyalty to their country whatsoever, a lot of them just kind of cave. And so the common people are shocked. It's like, what do you mean? You just sort of like sat back when this guy decided that he was going to be king of Scotland? And it's actually the people themselves who rise up without these aristocrats who are supposedly their leaders, and they start to try to take back the country themselves. And William Wallace is just an ordinary guy. He probably had some education. He probably had some wealth, but he's not an aristocrat. And so he steps forward and he leads the army, and he actually defeats Edward at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Later, in 1298, you have William Wallace defeated at Falkirk. So it does go back and forth. There's Falkirk, Falkirk. Falkirk. You ever see a picture of Scotland and you see these huge metal horse heads? That's Falkirk. Okay, they've got this really cool set of statues. Those are not actually horses; they're kelpies. And kelpies are a mythological, kind of like a Loch Ness monster, but the kelpies are this mythological horse-headed creature. But it makes for a really cool tourist attraction, put it that way. And then in 1290, Edward expelled all the Jews from England. So anyone who was Jewish who was living in England was expelled. They weren't invited back. You don't need to write this down, but Oliver Cromwell, who gets a little bit of undeserved bad press as far as historians are concerned, he actually invites them back. In 1656, Oliver Cromwell actually turns to the Jews of Europe and says, you are more than welcome to come back to England. But that's, 400 years later? Not quite. Edward II, 1307 to 1327, it's on your notes, you don't need that repeated, okay, is a very weak king. Possibly, maybe his father didn't give him enough independence to actually do anything. But for whatever reason, he gets extremely friendly with different men.
What?
His favorite, and basically the favorite is sort of like the king's best friend, but there was a lot of suspicion about this, was Piers, P-E-I-R-S, Piers, Gaveston, G-A-V-E-S-T-O-N, S-T-O-N, Piers Gaveston. He and Piers Gaveston behaved in such a way that it was quite shocking to the nobility. And also Piers Gaveston started to get more and more arrogant. He started acting almost as if he was a co-ruler of England, and the nobles kill him in 1312. So I said, you know what, we're done with this, and they kill the king's favorite. He is married to a princess from France, but everyone is quite shocked, including the French royal family, because at the wedding, it's not the bride and groom, it's the groom and Piers Gaveston. And well, yeah, he's at the royal table, and the whole time he's talking to Piers Gaveston, he's completely ignoring Isabella of France. She comes to be called the she-wolf, so she was quite feisty. But here she's shocked. I mean, if you were a princess anywhere, forget Disney, you knew what your duty was. Your duty was to marry someone who is going to cement an alliance with your country. It's not necessarily someone you would have met before. It's not necessarily someone you would ever like. But your duty was to cement that peace treaty with the production of children. Okay? So forget Disney. Everything in Disney, being a princess was probably a horrible, horrible thing to happen to you. I imagine most of them kind of wish they weren't. But anyway, here's this shock. The French ambassadors are all there. It's like, you're really showing quite disrespect to our princess that we have given to you for your queen, when all your attention, and he's showering gifts on Piers Gaveston. And and everyone's sitting there going, what's going on here? And so finally, well, that's how the nobles felt. And finally, Piers loses his head. Okay, they kill him in 1312. Then in 1314, he loses Scotland. So Scotland, he had controlled it. His father had killed William Wallace. If you decide to watch Braveheart, just realize it is rated R for violence. And particularly, William Wallace is killed by being hung, drawn, and quartered. So what they would do is, if you've ever heard somebody, like in a movie or something, said, and this person shall be hanged by the neck until dead, you think, well, what else would happen? No, they would hang them until almost dead and then cut them down so that they could basically torture them. For William Wallace, so they hung him till he was nearly dead. They took him back down again, and then they disemboweled him. Okay, that takes a while for you to die, and then they ripped his body into 4 pieces. So pretty horrific way to die. Edward considers himself now to be King of Scotland after this. But this particular uprising by William Wallace has sort of inspired a guy called Robert the Bruce. Remember the Bruce in the Commons, who was going to be in charge of Scotland? And Robert the Bruce kind of gets inspired. His father sat on the edge because he had estates in England. His father's really not sure which way to go. Robert the Bruce decides, hey, I've got a shot at being king of a country. And therefore, I'm going to go for that. So he invites his main rival, okay, Comyn, to a church of all places. And he says to him, look, we need to have a chat. He gets close enough to Comyn, he pulls out a knife, and he stabs him to death in the church. Okay, and that was considered to be a pretty bad sin. It's bad enough to kill somebody who was just coming to talk. This was not a battle. I mean, killing on the battlefield was acceptable, but killing somebody who didn't see it coming, sort of a sneak attack, and then you did it in a church where probably Comyn was a little bit more feeling that he was safe. The problem with Comyn, as far as the Scots are concerned, was he was quite happy to kind of rule for Edward. Okay, kind of like being a Herod under the Romans. So Robert the Bruce has basically killed somebody. Okay, he's a murderer at this point. But he does. 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn. B-A-N-N-O-C-K. B-U-R-N. A burn is a stream. Okay. So the Battle of Bannockburn, He loses Scotland. And remember what I said about a medieval king? Your only reason for existence was the fact that you were actually able to win battles, and he's not. Now they have a problem. The Scots do. Robert the Bruce has won the battle. Okay, they've thrown the English out, but he now needs to be made king. Okay, he's got a murder to his credit as well as some other rather bad behavior. And so what he has to do is he has to actually write to the Pope, and he has to argue that Scotland did not belong to England. Now the problem is England has two archbishops, Archbishop of York, Archbishop of Canterbury. Scotland doesn't. Okay, so they can't say that they are a separate region. Finally, you do get one in St. Andrews. But how do you argue you're an independent country when Edward's done a very good job convincing the Pope that, hey, Scotland always should have been part of England. They were just kind of a bunch of rebels up there, and I finally, took care of them. And by the way, the guy who wants to be their king, stabs somebody to death in a church when he didn't see it coming. And so they have to argue they never were English. And out of this comes the Declaration of Arbroath, which I quoted to you at the beginning. And part of the Declaration of Arbroath is, for as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we, on any conditions, be brought under English rule. Okay, so they're saying we're not English, and if there's only 100 of us left, we're not going to stop fighting. Okay, it is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honor that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life himself. And that's part of the Declaration of Arbroath, which they bring to the Pope in order to say, yes, we should be independent. Okay, the Pope agrees, and so basically that's seen as sort of Independence Day for Scotland. April the 6th is the date, but you don't need to worry about that. It's why you will see coming up, if you see some advertising about, and the Government of Canada actually acknowledges this. You don't get a holiday for it, but it's an acknowledged holiday in Canada. It's Tartan Day. And Tartan Day is an acknowledgement of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1314 on April the 6th, as I said. Anyway, back to Edward. Edward II has lost Scotland. He has annoyed the nobles with his behavior, with Piers Gaveston. And then he takes up with another guy. Okay. He takes up with Hugh Despencer. H-U-G-H, space, small D-E, space, capital S-P-E-N-C-E-R. Now, Princess Diana was Diana Spencer. She's not descended from this particular Spencer family. His favorite was Hugh Despencer. And Hugh and his father, also called Hugh, started to really take advantage of this relationship with the king. And what the Spencers would do was they'd look around for estates that weren't strong and basically just take them over. Okay, they behaved more like a cartel or a mafia or like a Hell's Angels group than they behaved like anything else. And different people, different widows, would be forced to marry people of their choosing, and they were starting to amass huge amounts of property. But if anybody said anything, well, the king's the only one you can go to, and that's not going to happen. So finally, the nobles get fed up again, and in 1326, the barons kill Hugh Despencer and his father.
1326.
1326. So he has two of his favorites executed. His wife has had it at this point. She's pretty fed up. She does have a child, so there is an heir to the throne at this point. And she's very much worried because of his behavior over the years that something bad's going to happen to her. Okay, she has produced an heir. Okay, called Edward again. So she's produced a child, and she's kind of worried, like, what's going to happen now? Will he find another favorite, and I'll just get it shoved in a drafty old castle until I die? And she's quite worried about this. So she comes up with a clever little scheme. The King of France is saying, look, you may be King of England, but if you want to keep being Duke of Normandy, like every other duke in the kingdom, you have to come and you have to kneel before me, and you have to swear obedience to me. Okay? This is the problem with these aristocrats having estates in multiple countries. Because as the Duke of Normandy, as the Count of Anjou, as the Duke of Aquitaine, he has to go and bow to the King of France and swear loyalty to him. That's what every aristocrat has to do. And the King of France says, look, I don't care if you're King of England, you still have to come and you still have to kneel before me. And so his wife, Isabel, comes with quite a brilliant idea. She says, I know, I'll take our son to France. The king's her brother. I'll take our son to France, and how about our son kneels to the King of France and promises all of the things that a noble has to promise, and that way you as King of England don't have to do it, but the ceremony has been done, and that'll be okay. And for whatever reason, he falls for it. He doesn't seem to have any idea that she's got a boyfriend, Roger Mortimer. So Roger Mortimer and the Queen and her children, she has a couple of them, but primarily the heir to the throne, all go off to France and start a rebellion against Edward. Eventually, and a lot of people, when Isabella and Roger Mortimer come back to England, a lot of people cheer for her. Okay, yes, she's the King of France's sister, but she's our queen, and she's been treated really badly. And a lot of people in England were very, very disgusted with the way that Edward had been treating Isabella. As far as they were concerned, Isabella is Queen of England, and here her husband has treated her extremely badly. He gave her hardly any money. She was basically going to her brother saying, can you send money? I don't have enough money to pay the servants in my household. And there were rumors that he was actually just going to lock her up somewhere until she died. So people in England are pretty disgusted. You shouldn't have treated her. So when Roger and Isabella come back, there's a lot of English people who go to her side and they champion her because they're pretty sick of it. What happened under Edward was he's got these favorites. And as soon as, whether it be Piers Gaveston or whether it be Hugh Despencer, these guys started to basically rip off all the noble families in England. Nobody dares stand up to them when they come for your stuff or they come for whatever they want from you because they've got the king's authority, they've got the king's backing. And so people are absolutely sick of Edward II, and they champion Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who managed to win the battle. And they, well, he has an interesting death. Edward II. It involves a red-hot poker. I won't tell you where they stuck it. That is how he died. Red hot, like a piece of metal. Superheated piece of metal. Moving on. So yeah, he got it in the end. Anyway, Isabella gets called the She-Wolf. So if you look on Netflix, there's actually a couple. There's a documentary called The She-Wolves of England, and it actually goes through a number of queens who managed to become extremely powerful in their own right. So what happens is Isabella's son, Edward III, is still young, so she rules for him. Okay, she's regent. That's how it works. If a child is too young, usually his mother is regent, and you'll have a couple of nobles in the realm who will look after and rule on behalf of the child until he grows old enough to be able to become king himself. Edward's not especially grateful to his mother for her behavior. And in fact, he seemed to have actually got along fairly well with his dad. He certainly doesn't like the fact that mom's got a boyfriend. And so what happens is, in the end, Edward rises up against his mother. He doesn't kill his mother. He puts her in a drafty old castle, which is what she was actually afraid of from the beginning. And he does execute Roger Mortimer. Isabella continues to write letters to her brother in France saying, please send soldiers to, rescue me, to liberate me. Please send things to, make my life a little more comfortable. And it doesn't happen. She's basically locked in a castle. She's given the bare minimum. Eventually she dies. Edward III rules from 1327 to 1377. Extremely long reign. The beginning of it, of course, though, his mother's reigning for him. In 1340, along comes bubonic plague. It's on your chart. It's on your sheet. I gave you all the dates on the sheet. Don't worry about those. 1327 to 1377. He rules for 50 years. That's a very long reign. So Edward III, Black Death comes in the middle of his reign in 1340. And things are going pretty badly for him. He needs very, very high taxes to keep fighting the 100 Years' War in France. So the 100 Years' War, which is about 112 years actually, the 100 Years' War is going so that they can try to get this throne, which should have been given to Henry II, but wasn't. And so for 100 years, you've got the kings of England going over and fighting in France. That's expensive. The amount of money in taxes that's being drained out of England in order to pay for these armies to run around France is huge. And then you get bubonic plague. All of a sudden, the population of your country has dropped by maybe 33 to 35%. A third to, about a third of your population has died. In some areas, half. So in some, you go into some, they have them, they call them DMV, which I know in the States is Department of Motor Vehicles, but in history, a DMV is a deserted medieval village. And people would come along to a village at this time, and there would not be a living soul in the village. You would just have, it'd be an absolute ghost town. But at least with our ghost town, there's not bodies in every house. So every house you'd go into, people would have died of the plague. So you go through this village and there'd be nothing left but all the dead bodies in the village. Some villages, 90% of the village died of bubonic plague. The 10% that are left is like, why would I stay here? And so a lot of those people moved elsewhere. Are they allowed to move elsewhere? No, because they're serfs. They're owned by the estate. However, let's say I own an estate, all right, and I desperately need workers. There's nobody to bring in the crops in the field because half of my serfs have died of bubonic plague. And then 10 of you guys show up and you say, look, our village, everybody died. We're the only people left. We need somewhere to go. Am I going to turn you over to my next door neighbor? No, I desperately need your work. So now you're going to be working for me. Are you still a serf? No, you're not. You're now hired labor. And so what happens is bubonic plague, for those who survive it, is actually really good. Okay? Despite the emotional turmoil of everybody around you dying. Because all of a sudden, you are valuable. You're not just a serf who works my fields and I have no idea who you are, and if you starve to death, I don't care. You're now valuable work because I need somebody to bring my crops in from the field. So now I'm willing to give you more freedom. A lot of people, when bubonic plague starts to spread and everyone dies, they flee their villages, they go to London. Now, there was a rule. If you were a serf and you could get to one of these free cities, London being a perfect example, but there were lots of others. So the city is free. There is no noble in charge of London. Okay? London exists almost like the Stony Reserve. It exists outside of local government. And how is it being run? It's being run by the businessmen who live in London, electing their own Lord Mayor. And it's this independent entity. And the king is not going to do anything because of the taxes he gets from it, which are keeping his kingdom afloat. So they're allowed this independence. And so what happens, if you are a serf and you make it to one of these cities and you survive there for 1 year and 1 day, you're free. You can never be a serf again. And so that freedom is something a lot of people are trying to get. And when human labor becomes so absolutely vital after bubonic plague, the people who survive it suddenly are a lot better off than they were before. Some of them stay on the same estates, they stay serfs, they don't get any freedom, but others start to move around. And because they're so valuable, nobody's going to turn them over to their former landlord because you desperately need their labor. So things are starting to change. Edward III has some very successful victories in the 100 Years' War. So he does come down to us as being kind of a really militarily successful king. But as far as actually ruling the country, he's not good at all, okay? So bubonic plague comes through, high taxes, reduced population. So you're trying to get the same amount of tax, but from only 60% of the people. So if you try to make, and this is what's happening in Calgary right now. The city of Calgary wants the taxes that it used to get from all those downtown office buildings. Some of those downtown office buildings are only half full. Okay, there's no businesses renting them. If there's no business renting them, then how can the office building actually afford to pay the same amount of tax to the city of Calgary? So the city of Calgary has taken a really big financial hit because of vacancies in all those office towers downtown. They desperately need people to move into those office towers, pay the rent for that space, so then the office tower can afford to pay the city of Calgary taxes. Same thing. How do you get the same amount of tax from 60% of the people? Okay. What are you going to do? If you raise the tax on everybody, then they become angry. And we've already seen in England, ticking off people's not a good thing to do. And in 1341, Parliament insists on examining his finances. We've been giving you all this tax money. What exactly are you doing with it? Unheard of anywhere else. For Parliament to go to the king and says, hand over the ledgers. We want to know where you're spending the money. The king's not really in charge, is he? Okay. If you want more money, we need to know where the money we already gave you went. So hand over your ledgers and we're going to examine your finances. Really, really humiliating and shameful for any medieval king, but he doesn't have a choice. He was not especially well liked. And when he was old, okay, as I said, he ruled for 50 years. He's old. He's extremely overweight. So here's the king in his bedchamber dying. And when he dies, everybody just walks out the door and leaves the body lying there. And the king's mistress, Alice Paris, steals all the rings off his dead fingers. There's actually nobody looking after the king's body enough that the mistress is just like, you know, and we have her in history. I mean, you know, we think, isn't a mistress something you don't tell anyone about? No, it was published. Everybody knew who she was and what she did. And so basically he dies and everybody goes, okay, king's dead. And off they go. And here she is busy pulling all the rings off his fingers. And so his dead body is just left there. Not very well treated. The throne passes between different descendants of Edward. Okay, it goes back and forth. So if you notice after Edward, you flip to your next page. Okay, that's the War of the Roses. Okay, it's a mess. The throne of England is passing back and forth between different descendants of Edward. I'm not going to go through a huge amount of detail on that. It's really confusing, and it's just going between these different people who are fighting over it. Why is it called the War of the Roses? Because they went and got roses, like, are they with them? No, okay. What happened is it's between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. So what has happened is, if you notice on your chart there, I need to look at my own chart here. That's how confusing it is. If you look at your chart there, under the War of the Roses, you've got Edward III. His son is Edward the Black Prince. He was called that because his armor was black. His second son is the Duke of Gaunt, John of Gaunt, who was Duke of Lancaster. The House of Lancaster's symbol was a red rose. Okay, same as the wild rose is a symbol for Alberta. The symbol for the House of Lancaster is a red rose. And his third son is Edmund, Duke of York. And the York royal family, their symbol was the white rose. So the War of the Roses is between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Okay? Edward the Black Prince, you notice, actually none of Edward's sons become king. It's one of the problems when a king lasts for 50 years, he usually outlives his sons in many cases. And so what happens is when Edward dies, the oldest son is dead, and so it goes to his son. And so you get Richard II, 1377 to 1399, and that is the first sort of time. Things are not too bad at that point. Richard II is a child. He's 3 years old. So this is what happens. Your sons are all dead, and the point at which you die, your grandsons are children. Yep.
I was going to say, like, aren't the Lancaster, New York, and York, are those the Romeo and Juliet families?
No, those are Italian families. That was Montague and Capulet.
Oh,
Is Romeo and Juliet. But again, they're related. You can see they're cousins, but they're fighting nonstop. Yeah. You will have, because Shakespeare wrote plays about all of these guys.
Oh.
So there's a lot of Shakespearean plays. On the other hand, how far do you believe a Shakespearean play if it has anything to do with history? Okay, it's a bit shaky. But he wrote plays about all of these kings in the Wars of the Roses, because at the end of it is when Shakespeare comes. So if you look at Henry VIII, is the end of it. So the end of the War of the Roses is actually Henry VIII. Well, his father actually, but I won't get into that. And we start a new family called the House of Tudor. Anyway, Richard II is 3 years old. And people are willing to wait for him to grow up. Okay, maybe things will get better. We had 3 Edwards who weren't great. Well, Edward the Black Prince was incredibly popular. Okay, the common people liked him a lot. And maybe his son Richard will be finally a good king. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt broke out. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. When is Luther? For your dates. You remember you should have a few dates that you can hook things onto. When's Luther? 1500. We're just going to round it up. 1500. This is 120 years before Luther. But the Reformation's actually already started. Okay? Luther is where basically it comes to a boiling point and the big break happens. But even in 1381, people are saying, hey, the church has drifted so far away from where it should be that you do have all sorts of different places. And so what happens is there is a guy called John Ball. John Ball is a preacher, and his sermons inspire the Peasants' Revolt. And very much his sermons are what we would consider to be, well, yeah, that's how things should be. Because the Protestant Reformation is what brings in, finally, after all of these years, the idea of the equality of all people. If you are a king, that's a job given to you by God. If you are a farmer, that is a job given to you by God. But as far as God's concerned, you are both equal, and you should be doing the best with the job God gave you. To kings, that is unbelievable. No way. There's no way I'm equal to that farmer out there. Much less I am not equal to the guy who's been hired to sweep the horse manure off the streets. But in truth, that's what Protestantism says. It says it doesn't matter whether you're king or queen. It doesn't matter whether you are the lowest person in society. In God's eyes, you are 100% equal. And here in 1381, this is being preached by John Ball. His very famous statement, and this is a little bit different from modern English, okay? Delved means to dig in a field, okay? So be a farmer. Span is to spin cloth, okay? And his famous saying was, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? When Adam and Eve were born, where were the aristocrats? Where were the kings and queens? Didn't exist. Okay? So he's really preaching an extremely radical equality of mankind. Now, it depends on what history book you read. Some people will call John Ball, you know, a crazed fanatic. I don't see what's crazy about that. And that's the same thing as when you look at history books, be careful. Every one of them is coming from some sort of point of view. Most people come down really hard on Henry II for his fight with Archduke of Canterbury, de Becket. Okay? But as far as we're looking back, it's like, why should you as a priest be under a different legal system than everybody else? And if a priest rapes somebody, why should he not face the same justice any other rapist would face? And we look at that and we say, well, that's normal to us. But history books will usually make de Becket into this glowing figure. I mean, he was sainted by the Catholic Church. People pray to him for their salvation. Which is another problem with Catholicism, but you're going to John Ball here, and he was a Lollard. 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 That was a nasty term, okay, that was given to them, sort of like the British calling the Americans Yankees, and they said, hey, we kind of like it, we'll keep it. They were followers of John Wycliffe. So Wycliffe Bible Translators is named after him. And John Wycliffe, his big thing was he wanted the Bible to be printed in English. And people were horrified. That means those common people can read it. Because what would happen is, at this point, you're getting English literacy. You're getting people with a basic amount of English literacy, but only the aristocrats have Latin. And so what they've done is they've kept the Bible in Latin, so only highly educated people can read it. And the common person out there can't read it. And Wycliffe got mocked by a bishop, you know, like, what are you trying to, he says, you know what, I will make it so that the man who pushes the plow will know more of God's word than you do. And that was actually real, because that bishop actually didn't know a whole lot of scripture himself. So you've got these people in charge of the church. They never read the Bible themselves, but they don't want anyone else reading it, because that might give them ideas. They should only believe about the Bible what we tell them to believe about the Bible. And what I find sort of disturbing about modern church is how many people just believe what somebody else tells them in the Bible and don't read it for themselves. People died to have the right to read it for themselves, and we have how many Bibles in our homes? 10, 20 on electronic devices. And so what happens is John Ball inspires, okay, people with this radical idea of equality. The actual revolt is led by a guy called Wat Tyler, W-A-T-T-Y-L-E-R. What do they want? What is the President's Revolt demanding? Demanding religious liberty. So again, it's 120 years before Luther, but people are already starting to push back against this Catholicism, probably because it took this far for it to reach a tipping place, where it got so far from Scripture that people said, okay, this is it. Bohemia, there was a major leader, okay? John Huss, or Jan Hus, okay? You know how our last names have meanings? You cooked your goose is a reference to the martyrdom of Jan Hus. Hus means goose. Okay, it means you push things too far and you got, killed. And so what happened was Wycliffe actually was able to live out his life, and he died a natural death. But they got so mad at him later on that they actually dug up his bones and burned his bones at the stake. That had to hurt. You think, how pathetic. You're actually going to go get his bones, and we're going to take his bones, we're going to burn his bones at the stake because you can't burn him. So they wanted religious liberty. They wanted equality in society. All people are equal. Shocking idea. And the end of serfdom. So in 1381, you've got a revolt in England to end serfdom. That is one of the parts of the French Revolution. Not until 1789 are the French actually having a revolution to end serfdom. Okay, so England is like 500 years ahead of the rest of Europe in where it's going as far as people's attitudes. The Peasants' Revolt began May 30th, 1381. when a tax collector tried to collect the poll tax, P-O-L-L. The poll tax was a tax on every human being, and it was the same whether you're rich or poor. So the poll tax, if you were rich, you probably shrugged it off. It was pocket change. If you're poor, it might be that last step between you and famine and starvation. The rebels made it to London itself. And the king is terrified. And all of the people are terrified. And one of the things that they're going after is they believe, and a lot of the, so remember when a king is a child, somebody else gets to rule for him? It was actually bishops. It was religious leaders that were, Catholic religious leaders that were ruling for him. And what they were demanding was they were demanding that the people who were advising the king, they weren't against the king, he was only 14 years old, but they believed that the king was getting bad advice. And they wanted the king's advisors brought out to them. You could just imagine what was going to happen to those people if you brought them out. And they're terrified. They're quaking in their boots in the Tower of London, which is a castle and a palace and a prison, okay, different parts of it. And they're in the Tower of London, and they're shaking in their boots. What do we do? We've got this peasant mob out there, and they're demanding religious liberty, equality for all, and the end of serfdom, and pretty much the heads of, or at least call to account, the people who've been advising the king, who've come up with these extra taxes. June 14, they agree to their demands. So they're out there for a good 2 weeks. And the king agrees to meet Tyler and the rebels, a place called Smithfield. And the rebels think, wow, the king is on our side. The king is actually a good person. Amazing at 14 years of age that this king was actually bold enough to ride out by himself while all of his adult counselors are quaking in the Tower of London. 14 years old. He rides out to the rebels. And they all treat him very respectfully. And he takes out a sword and chops off Wat Tyler's head. And nobody knows what to do. That was your leader. And he kills Tyler, and he rescinds the agreement. John Ball is hung, drawn, and quartered. And his head gets put on a pike. A pike is a spike. On London Bridge. And from then on, they call him the Mad Priest of Kent. So he had to be crazy. Can you imagine those sorts of demands? And so it comes out from this time period that who gets to write history? The victors, okay? The winners write history. And so a lot of people have gone back to some of these insane people in the past and said, well, wait a minute, were they that insane? American Civil War, okay? There's a guy called John Brown. Okay, and John Brown has come down to us in history as being insane. What was so insane about him? He lived near Lake Placid, New York, where the Olympics has been held twice. I visited his house, actually. What was so insane about him? Well, people record it. Okay, this is before the American Civil War. That he would sit down at his table and eat with African Americans and call them Mr. Okay, at this point, slaves were not given the respect of Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones. Even if they were free, they would only get a first name. They wouldn't have that respect. And people are shocked. He must be crazy. He's sitting down and he's eating with black people and he's treating them respectfully. How insane do you get? So was he insane? So I don't have time to show it anymore because other things have kind of encroached into the social curriculum. I used to do the American Civil War, and I had a video on John Brown. It's interesting. The white historians are, he was crazy. The African American historians are saying, what's so crazy about him? He laid down his life and he died so that the slaves could be free. How's that crazy? He actually started a rebellion. And his idea was he was going to go to a place called Harper's Ferry. And he was going to take all the guns out of the government armory at Harper's Ferry and arm the slaves and start an uprising to end slavery. And this is before the Civil War. And the Battle Hymn of the Republic was actually started as a song to mock John Brown. So if you think of the refrain, okay, it used to be, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his truth goes marching on. So the refrain of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, there's a woman on a train, and she's heard this mocking song about John Brown, and she actually turns it into the Battle Hymn of the Republic. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Okay? And that dying to make men free is what, basically what John Brown did. So be very careful when you read in history that someone was crazy. Maybe they just had an idea that was far before its time. And we would look back on that person and say, hey, this had been now, I'd probably join in. There's constant tension between the king and Parliament. The king is constantly making demands, and Parliament's pretty ticked off at it. Okay, I'm going to leave Richard II at that point, okay, so that we can watch some Terra Nova. I will continue with him next class.